4 drivers stopped for a snack, a smoke, or a bathroom break, and in less than an hour, each of them was convinced someone wanted them off the road. A man sitting on the convenience store floor, staring at a fridge, zip ties tucked under a car seat, a woman who pretended to leave the restroom and then crept back, a van that wouldn't stop following. These are real stories from people who drove empty highways at night and drove out with questions that never really closed. I want you to picture that long stretch of asphalt, the kind where the yellow lines feel endless and the nearest house is a dot on a map. At 2 a.m., everything shrinks to headlights and the hum of your own tires. The ordinary, gas, coffee, a cigarette, suddenly sits next to the extraordinary. People you don't know, places with no witnesses, decisions made in the dark. That's the setting for the first of 4 accounts I'm sharing tonight. I was in my early 30s then, working as a coder who burned the midnight oil. I'd been on a sprint, crunching lines of code until my eyes felt gritty, and by 3 in the morning my brain was begging for a break. There was a convenience store off the exit I took sometimes when I needed a fresh coffee and something to snack on. It was one of those places where the fluorescent lights never really turned off, where a humming refrigerator lived behind the counter and an overhead radio played the same 3 songs in a loop. The parking lot was cracked, and a single sodium lamp threw everything into a washed-out amber. I remember the exact little rituals: lock the car, dig for a couple of dollars, stand in the aisle deciding between a sandwich or a sad microwaved burrito. That night, when I pushed the glass door open, the smell of bleach and engine oil hit me. The store seemed almost empty, no one at the register, only the cashier's silhouette behind a column of stacked lottery tickets. I walked past the aisle of candy, grabbed a bottle of water, and then realized I was there longer than I needed to be. It felt like one of those moments where your body wanted caffeine, but your head wanted to walk around and not sit back down in front of C++ for another hour. I glanced toward the back of the store, near the refrigerated cases, and froze for a beat. A man was sitting on the floor, back against the frozen food display. He was hunched, a brown coat pulled tight, head down. From where I stood, it looked like he was staring straight at the glass of the refrigerator, or maybe he was staring at nothing at all. He didn't move when people came and went. He didn't react when the fluorescent light flickered above his head. There was a weird stillness about him that made the air feel colder. I told myself he was probably homeless or drunk, maybe tired, and that's why I shrugged it off. I paid at the counter and headed outside. The night air felt sharp against my face.
I clicked my key fob, walked to the car, and then paused, because as I crossed the lot, something odd happened. The man stood up, not slowly but fast, like someone who'd been waiting for the right second. He didn't look at me. He sprinted across the cracked pavement toward a dark pickup truck parked by the far curb. I'd seen the truck before I saw the man get in. It was an old pickup, two-tone paint flicking off at the fenders, a bed caked in dust, the kind of truck that blends into any highway night. The headlights off, no one at the wheel. The man climbed into the passenger seat, and the driver's side door slammed. Then the truck backed out of the spot and roared across the lot toward the exit. I started the car. For a second, I thought I was overreacting, that he was just leaving with his friend. Then the truck swung onto the road behind me. Its lights dropped onto my rear in a tight beam. At first, I thought it might pass. Then the driver began flashing headlights, hard, repeatedly, and then honking. It was that long, urgent staccato honk, not the half-hearted beep of someone saying hello. A wave of adrenaline pushed through me. My heart kicked up into my throat. Maybe it was road rage. Maybe they were drunk and thought we were playing some dumb game. Whatever it was, it escalated fast. The truck rode my bumper, then jerked around to pull alongside, then zoomed ahead and slammed the brakes. When I slowed because my instinct had me afraid to floor it on that stretch of 2-lane, the truck lunged, cutting me off. The honking turned to a banging, something metallic against my bumper. I remember the sound like a fist on a drum, and the truck shoved forward so hard my own car lurched. That moment, your whole mind sorts. You calculate exits, you think about passing, you think irrationally about reversing, about calling 911 and hearing that recorded voice ask you to hold. There was nowhere to go. The highway was quiet, houses were few, on-ramps were miles apart. I remember seeing my side mirror catch the truck's profile, the driver's face and silhouette. No time to see details, just the sensation of intent. He seemed to be steering to keep me boxed in, and his headlights flashed like some strobe announcing menace. I did the only thing I could think might end it without us both slamming into a ditch. I accelerated. I tried to put distance between us, imagining the shoulder as a refuge. The truck matched me, revving, then swinging into the lane beside me like a predator that wanted to show teeth. Its bumper kissed my rear left quarter panel once, hard enough to make the car swerve. I gripped the wheel so tight my knuckles went white. My stomach rolled. The truck tried to ram my side again, and I could feel the jolt through the hoop of my steering wheel. For a frantic stretch, it was just us two, metal and sound in the thin line of y'all taint. Somewhere in that blur, I took a back road I had only used once before.
My only thought was to get off the main artery, to break the pattern the truck was trying to trap me in. There were stretches of gravel and a narrow shoulder, weeds brushing the undercarriage. He followed. On a blind curve, with my turn signal lit like a plea, I held steady and aimed for a cut through an overgrown service road that ran parallel for a mile. I knew if someone could follow me through a patch like that, they were not simply mad. They were committed. That scared me so sharp I almost lost my composure. I turned into the service road and slammed my foot down. It felt reckless, but the hammering of panic drowned out the practical voice. The truck clung to the lane beside me, then tried to overtake. As we kicked gravel, he clipped the rear of my bumper again. This time the impact felt like a shove that sent my car across a patch of soft dirt. The steering tugged under my hands. I jerked the wheel, countered, and somehow the car threaded itself back onto packed ground. The truck went too wide on the next corner and hit a patch of mud. I watched it fishtail, saw the driver slam at the steering wheel. Then, on a narrow stretch where the shoulder dropped into a ditch, he nudged my side one more time. The car veered. I corrected, kept it together. It wasn't heroism or luck. It was a series of sharp, tiny decisions that added up. Swerve here, brake there, use momentum to your advantage. I tried to keep calm, but there was an animal clarity to my thinking. Get somewhere with people, light, witnesses. Up ahead, a small access road branched off toward a row of warehouses. One of them had a rundown loading dock with lights still on. I aimed for it, heart beating like a fist. The truck followed. I pulled onto the dock and stopped. My headlights washed the corrugated metal in a stack of pallets. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the truck busted onto the dock behind me and tried to ram the car forward. The impact pitched me, doors screamed. I kept my seatbelt on like it was a tether to sense. I revved and reversed, but the truck caught my bumper again. It nudged me to the edge where a narrow embankment dropped off into brush. There was no theatrics, just a constant quiet brutality in the way he tried to back me into nowhere. At that point, I realized that a full stop was too dangerous. If he wanted to make us both roll, he could. I floored it and aimed for the small gap between two trailers, old tires chattering underneath. I watched the truck take the turn too fast and clip the tail end of a trailer. Its driver overcorrected. The truck's back end swung. For a heartbeat, it was wild and uncontrolled, and then it nudged the gravel and slid off the service road, tires throwing dirt. It skidded into the ditch, and the truck rolled to a stop, engine coughing. I watched it sit there, billowing a little smoke. The driver's door opened, and no one came out. I sat there with the engine idling, lungs working like a bellows, hands shaking.
I took the keys out of the ignition and fumbled for my phone. My fingers moved like someone else's. I dialed 911. I told them where I was, what had happened. I listened to the operator ask the usual questions. Were there injuries? Plate number? I told them I didn't know the plate. I described the truck, old two-tone, pickup, brown coat. And the operator told me officers were en route and advised me to stay in a safe place. I hung up, got out of the car, and watched the ditch where the truck had slid. Dust settled around it like the end of a fight scene. A couple of minutes later, a figure left the truck, walked back toward the warehouse area, and vanished into the dark between trailers. I stood under the sodium light and tried to make sense of why any of that had happened. I felt small and raw. The sky was pinpricked with stars, and the only sound was the far hum of a highway that had briefly become something else entirely. I waited until the first patrol showed up. They took my statement, eyes steady and professional, as if the night had offered them many such conversations. I told them about the man sitting on the floor in the convenience store and how he'd sprinted to the pickup. I told them about the way the truck had used my car like a lever, how it had nudged me toward the ditch. They said they checked the store's CCTV and circled the area. They didn't promise anything. That was the worst part. There are no guarantees in a story like that. Evidence lives in grainy footage, sometimes in dented metal, and sometimes only in the way your hands shake weeks later. The officer left with a radio sweep and a polite pat on my shoulder. I drove home with my coffee going cold in the cup holder, and my code editor still open on my laptop, waiting for me like nothing had happened. I shut the lid and tried to sleep, but every small noise in the house sounded like an engine. For days, I found myself glancing at parking lots, at the far corner of convenience stores, where someone might be sitting on the floor. The world didn't change, only my sense of how thin the line was between routine and threat. The store later said they would review their footage. I never got a call that satisfied the question of why he'd followed me at all. That question lingered like a bruise. If you like real late-night horror, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this coming, and I don't want you to miss them.
He was a delivery driver making a long run, Phoenix to Lovington, hours of highway that ate the day and left you at the end with gravel stuck in your boots and a throat like dust. He worked nights because that's when the lanes were open and the money was better. He knew the desert, the short stretches where cell signal thinned and the sun left you alone with the stars. On Route 82, he saw a red hatchback pulled over on the shoulder, hazard lights blinking like a distress signal. A woman stood beside it, arm lifted in that universal gesture that used to stop motorists and start conversations. "Can you help me?" He thought about driving past. He'd been taught to be careful. Companies say, "Stay safe, call dispatch." But he also had a memory of his grandmother's voice about helping people. He pulled over, kept the engine running, and rolled his window down just enough to talk. The woman approached with a slow, shaking gait. Her speech was slurred. She asked if he had water. Her eyes darted like someone who was afraid of something not visible to him. Something about her unsettled him, though he couldn't say what. Maybe it was the way she kept deflecting questions, or the cheap perfume that masked the smell of something sour. He asked if she had called anyone. She said no, that her phone had died. He saw a charger in the hatchback when she opened the trunk, but that didn't register in the heat of the moment. The desert have a way of making your guard go up in minutes. He found himself doing the math. How far to the next town? What a tow would cost at 2 in the morning. He weighed empathy against caution. He told her he could give her a lift to the next gas station if she could get into the passenger seat. She hesitated. Her hands trembled. He felt the old tug. What if she needed help? Her left hand brushed the tar doorframe as if rooting herself. He opened the door and gestured her in. Her weight felt light, and she kept her coat zipped tight. They went a few miles in silence. The world around them flattened to the 2 lanes in the glow of the dash. He kept one hand on the wheel and one on the gear shift, a little nervous. That quiet lasted until the red hatchback pulled out and then swung into the lane behind them. 2 men crawled out of the driver and passenger seats and stood in the middle of the road as if they'd been waiting for him to pass. One of them carried something that caught the moonlight, a long, thin silhouette that the driver first assumed was a walking stick. But it wasn't a stick. It was something that made the driver's gut drop. It could have been a rifle or some other long object. He couldn't be sure, but the way the men moved made it clear they were not just stranded and in need of help. In the strip of desert light, they blocked the road like a roadblock you don't expect. There was a split second where the driver considered whether he should stop, back up, or just brake and wait.
The men's postures suggested that stopping would be a bad idea. The driver weighed what to do with the speed of someone who understood that hesitation could be costly. He hit the gas. He told me later that the decision was instantaneous and not necessarily rooted in bravado. It was survival instinct, coupled with the knowledge that there were vast miles behind him and a town ahead with people and pumps and light. He said he floored it because he could feel panic like a physical force in his chest. The woman in the passenger seat reached for the door. He swerved to block her hand. In that same motion, he caught a glimpse of movement through the rear window. One of the men had bent down near the back seat, fingers rifling in shadows. He couldn't see what they were holding, but whatever it was, it changed his calculus. He pulled into the first lit gas station he could find and stopped hard. The woman did not get out. She clutched the interior doorframe and looked at him with a face that read as both pleading and terrified. He told her, with his voice steady because it needed to be, to get out. She refused. When she didn't move, he reached back and felt the weight of something tucked beneath the seat. Small, square, a battery pack from a burner phone that had been jammed into the upholstery. He took a breath and leaned forward. At some point during that tense standstill, he realized there had been more going on in her car than a flat tire or a dead battery. He noticed movement under the seat near the floor, and when he fished around, he found a small wad of plastic ties, zip ties, the kind you use to bind wires in a hurry. They were tucked into the seam of the seat like something you hide when you don't want it seen. He didn't say anything out loud. He didn't need to. The presence of those zip ties felt like a punctuation mark that turned the scene into a sentence he hadn't wanted to finish. He had a gun in the glove box, something he rarely told anyone about. It was legal for him to carry, registered, kept for the kinds of situations that video news reports make you think about at 2 a.m. He didn't pull it unless he had to. But in the cramped neon glow of that station parking lot, with an empty highway behind him and two men who'd suddenly appeared in the road, he considered the tool in the glove box like a line of last resort. He told me later that he moved slowly and deliberately, not to threaten, but to create distance, both physical and tactical. He eased his hand into the glove box and felt the cold metal like the confirmation of an ugly possibility. He might need to use it. He didn't brandish it in anyone's face. He told her to get out of the car. She hesitated, mouth curling like she was trying to find the right sound. For a beat, it felt like a negotiation, and then the men in the road were moving toward the station, as if their plan had included this stop. The driver remembered his pulse like a drum.
He thought about police response times and the distance to the nearest dispatch. The woman finally opened the passenger door, but she didn't step out. She shuffled halfway and clung to the frame like a child on a porch, eyes wild. He said the word again, and when she still didn't move, he told her he would make her get out. That's where he paused when we talked, the moment right before he physically forced the woman out of the car, and before he looked under the seat and found that small dead battery and the zip ties tucked under the liner, like evidence the scene had been staging itself all along. He told me at the exact second the men were closing in, he had to make a split-second decision: stay and negotiate and risk being boxed in by two strangers on a deserted county road, or speed off and hope the woman wasn't bait for something worse. And that's where I want to stop for now, because the rest of his story is the kind you don't want to rush through, and it's where choices and consequences meet in the dark. The next part is the bit where an ordinary act of kindness could have turned the wrong way, where a handful of zip ties and a dead burner battery suddenly look like the props of a plan you never wanted to be part of. The rest is what he did when the men moved closer and the night folded in like a hand, and how he later woke up replaying every second. I'll pick up there, right at the moment the two men stepped off the shoulder, heading toward the lights of a lonely gas station, while a driver in a delivery truck decided whether to trust his gut or his goodwill. He jerked forward like a man who'd just been reminded there was a second he hadn't paid attention to. The two men were already closing the distance between the shoulder and the station lights. The woman in my passenger seat finally moved, slow, like someone pulling a thread until it came free, and then she stopped, hand on the frame as if that small hold could keep her from being yanked away. "I need you to get out," he said, voice low but steady. The words were practical. They had to be. He leaned forward, fingers on the edge of the seat, because the space between asking and making felt thin and dangerous. She looked at him in a way that flickered between pleading and something he couldn't read. That's the most stomach-tightening thing about moments like that. The eyes don't tell you which script you're in. When she didn't comply, he reached down behind the seat and felt fabric. His fingers brushed plastic, cool and slick, and he pulled out the little dead battery again. It sat in his palm like a clue you find mid-scene and wish you hadn't. He slipped his hand farther in, feeling along the seam, and then his fingers curled on the small bundle he had missed the first time, a set of plastic zip ties bundled like a promise of restraint. For a second, the world narrowed to the weight of those ties in his fist. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to.
Outside, the two men were less than 20 feet away now. The nearest pump threw a halo of light that painted the asphalt and made shadows look like shapes you could step into. One of the men, tall, broad, raised his arm and pointed at the station as if giving direction. In the gap between engine hums and furtive phone conversations, the tall one's mouth moved. It seemed like a plan was being narrated to the night. He opened the passenger door. She didn't step out fully, she clung. He reached across, put his hands on her shoulders, and physically guided her clear of the vehicle. Her legs were thin, and she didn't fight. Whatever script she'd been playing, it had ended at the hinge of the door. He grabbed the battery and the zip ties and shoved them into his jacket pocket. Then he looked up toward the men,
and in whatever the sanctified space between needing to be a good human and needing to live, he decided. He drove. He hit the gas before the men had time to react. The hatchback's engine answered like a curt whisper, and then quieted as it watched them go. The two men stood frozen for a second, mouths parted, then started running toward the road. One of them turned his head and shouted, but the words dissolved in the press of night. He didn't go to his house. He didn't try to sleep. He drove the remaining miles with the zip ties and the battery in his coat like a heavy, ugly talisman. He pulled into a well-lit truck stop and sat with the heater on until the coffee machine clicked and spat hot water into a paper cup. He called his dispatcher. He told the story in fragments, careful. He told enough that the person on the other end understood he'd been in something he didn't want to have a label for. Later, when the adrenaline ebbed, he wrapped the battery and the zip ties in a receipt and slid them into a glove compartment. He told me he couldn't bring himself to call the local sheriff's office, partly because of the gun in his glove box, partly because he understood how complicated these things become on paper. He didn't want an officer asking how he carried or why he hadn't called sooner. He weighed the cost of being right against the risk his own life might be turned into a legal problem. It's a calculus that a lot of people on the road have to make, and it's ugly and necessary. For weeks he replayed the scene, the way the woman's eyes had darted, the way the men had dropped into the road, the smell of cheap perfume mixed with exhaust. Sometimes he told himself he'd done the right thing, left, protected himself, and maybe stopped something. And sometimes he thought he might have been part of a setup, one more unwitting actor. He never got a follow-up call about the battery or the zip ties. No news came from any agency. The evidence he had stayed in his glove compartment, small and mute, and he kept driving because he had to. A stretch of desert overnight has a way of making you feel both exposed and absurdly self-reliant.
You learn to trust your instincts the way you learn which stretches of roads eat tires. You also learn the loneliness that comes with those instincts. They are sometimes the only thing standing between you and outcomes you'd rather not imagine. That night, he learned that being kind on the road can look a lot like being vulnerable, and being cautious can look like coldness. There isn't always a neat moral in the middle. He still works routes, but he told me he stopped picking up hitchhikers. He keeps the battery and the zip ties as a reminder, a small private archive of the night. And every time he tells the story, his voice tightens when he gets to the part about deciding to drive off. There are things that don't resolve. Why she was there, whether those men had done this before, what their plan truly was. Those questions hang, and they don't get answers. If you've ever shared the road with someone whose face you can't place in the light, you know how the memory lingers. You watch other drivers with a new kind of attention. You notice small things, how someone ties their hair, how they keep their hands near the door. You don't stop being compassionate, but you get smarter about the way you act on it. The next story is about that fine line of ordinary indignities turning into something much more invasive. A woman who used the privacy of a restroom to make someone else's night into terror. We were two people with a map and a loose plan. I was behind the wheel, she had a playlist and the kind of laugh that made the long miles less sharp. We'd been on the road for hours, Utah spilling into the plains and the interstate thinning out into little more than a black line. It was late, and the tank was low enough that we agreed to stop at the next service point for fuel and to stretch. We found a tiny gas station with a single pump and a sagging sign, like most of the time-worn places that have seen 1,000 strangers. She went inside while I kept the car running, the heater on idle. I watched the fluorescent storefront window as she crossed the parking lot and disappeared inside. She'd been a little anxious about the restrooms at smaller stations all week, stories she'd read, little precautions she'd taken. Tonight she said she'd go in first and check things out, which made sense. I'd rather she didn't take a solitary walk into an unfamiliar bathroom than anything else. Then I saw her hesitate at the door, hand on the handle like she'd been stopped by the same thing that sometimes stops you, a feeling. For a second I considered getting out and going in with her. The lot was empty, the attendant nodded at nothing. She went in anyway, slipping behind the narrow door. Time stretched. After a few minutes I thought she'd been held up at the sink. Another minute, and then a longer one. I checked my phone, no signal, and then I closed my laptop and walked in. The women's restroom was narrow and smelled faintly of cleaner and coffee. The light buzzed.
She was standing outside the stalls, face pale, breathing shallow.
She said a woman had followed her in and was in the third stall. She keeps faking like she's going to leave, my wife said. She walks out like she's decided to go, and then she comes back and stands near the sink. She's been saying she's sorry, but she keeps coming back. I asked a few questions. Did she look dangerous? Did she mention anything? And my wife shrugged like she wanted to laugh and cry at the same time. The woman was disheveled, coat hanging open, hair tangled. She kept saying things like she'd been traveling for days, that she'd lost track of time. But there was something else, an undercurrent of attention that made my skin prickle. She'd pace out of the restroom, walk to the door, then re-enter as if testing whether anyone was watching. My wife locked herself in a stall and texted me the way people do now, short sentences that mean everything. "She's still here," the message read. "She just came back in and started humming." I heard the hum when I stood near the sink, a thin, tuneless sound that scraped under bone. The woman wiped her hands on her coat and moved as if she owned more of the room than she had a right to. I asked the attendant if he could keep an eye on things. He shrugged, said he'd been awake too long to tell the difference between weird and dangerous. That's the weirdness of small towns and late nights. The people who work there have a threshold for odd that most of us don't. I felt a rush of helplessness. My rational mind cataloged the options, the simple ones, the safe ones, and then pushed them aside when the stakes were less certain than they needed to be. I pressed my phone to the stall door so she could speak through it. "Hey," I said, "are you okay?" Her voice was steady on the other side, a little higher than usual. "She keeps coming in. She says she's leaving, and then she comes back. I don't know what she wants." Through the thin barrier, I heard movement, heels on tile, a coat rustling. That's when I heard her, the woman's voice, whispering something like, "You remember me?" Words that meant nothing and made everything feel like a lie. She stayed in the stall for a long time, breathing like she was trying to count her breaths. Finally, she opened the door and walked out like she'd been held in something she'd rather forget. I followed as discreetly as I could. She walked past the pumps and into a shadow that skirted the building. For a moment, I thought the moment had ended. Then, out of the dark, the woman returned, standing by the restroom entrance with the sort of stillness people use when they want to be noticed without making motion. She held something in her hand, a slim shape that caught the light with a dull glint. I didn't see it clearly at first. Maybe that was part of how the brain tries to protect itself from what it can't interpret. She held the object close to her side, wrapped in the fold of a coat.
When my wife and I both registered the presence of it, a click ran through me like a cold chain. It might have been a pocket knife, it might have been a tool, I don't know. I do know that the woman's posture was not of someone who'd just come back to apologize. It was the posture of someone who'd been practicing a part and decided to play it again. We left. There was no dramatic chase or vocal confrontation, just a fast, purposeful move to the car and the slamming of doors that felt like a small, private declaration. The engine caught and the tires hissed on gravel. The woman stayed in the light by the restroom and watched us drive away. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She simply stood and let us go, like a piece being released. After that night, we didn't stop at another deserted station unless we had no choice. We refused stalls that had no attendant. We kept our doors locked while we pumped. The small rituals of travel became rules. My wife developed a habit of peeking into restrooms first and waiting for me to be sure they were empty. I know some people will read that and think it's paranoia. Maybe it is. But we learned what the smallest bit of uncertainty does to you when you're alone between towns. It multiplies until you're betting on outcomes you never wanted a stake in. We never reported the incident. There wasn't a crime registered, no theft, no assault, and in the morning light, the woman in the coat could easily have been anyone needing help. That's the terrible ambivalence. You can walk away safe and be accused of overreacting, or you can stay and put yourself in harm's way. We chose safety, and we lived with the question of whether we abandoned someone or avoided something worse. Either way, the memory hangs like a small bruise. Some nights I still see the woman's silhouette by the door and wonder whether she followed 50 other people down the highway that week. That kind of guesswork isn't unique. The last story is the one every driver fears. Someone who decides they're going to make sure you leave the road where they can control you. It happened to someone who worked the interstate for a living, who thought he knew the rhythm of trucks and rest areas, and then found himself being harassed by a van that wouldn't let him go. I'd been on I-80 for the better part of the night. The hours had blurred, the sun a promise an hour ahead. I stopped at a rest area that was supposed to be a quick break, a place to stretch, grab a sandwich, shake the drowsiness loose. The lot was empty except for one vehicle, a white cargo van parked under a lamp, 2 figures hooded in the front seats.
There was something about the glass-darkened windows and that stillness that made him pause, the way you do when you walk into a room and everyone stops talking. But the van was legal, and the type of thing you see on every highway. Delivery vans, contractors, people taking a nap. He decided to go in anyway. He left the engine running and the heater on low.
He walked to the vending machines, got a bottle of water, and stood in the fluorescent glare for a few minutes. When he came back out, the van's headlights were off. He thought he'd misread it. Maybe they'd been sleeping and hadn't woken up. He eased into the driver's seat, glanced in the rear view like any attentive person does, and then pulled away. The van started following. It was subtle at first. The van eased out behind him and kept a steady pace. He assumed it might pull off soon. It didn't. The van stayed on his tail, close enough that his mirror framed its shape as if deliberately present. He flicked his blinkers and changed lanes. The van matched. He took the next exit, thinking maybe it would stop on the ramp. The van took it too, like a shadow mimicking movement. That's when the instinct you know from all the stories kicked in. Something is wrong. He drove to the nearest truck stop, the kind with big lights and diesel pumps and plenty of other drivers. The van followed in like it belonged to the place. He parked near the lot's entrance where he could see comings and goings, and stepped out with his coffee in hand, trying to appear casual. The van idled near the exit, engine purring, and then rolled slowly up behind a line of tractor trailers as if waiting for someone. Every time he checked in his mirror, the van was a little closer. At one point, the van pulled alongside, and the driver gestured for him to roll his window down. He kept it up. Then the van lurched in front of him and stopped short, making him brake hard. The van's passenger window slid down for a moment, and a voice called something, an invitation, a threat, he couldn't tell. The truckers nearby were watching now, and you could feel the place tighten around the potential for trouble. He drove off again. The van followed, cutting through the lot to get back on the interstate. He took a different exit this time, not because he had a plan, but because he hoped the motion would break whatever had attached itself to him. The van matched exit for exit. He began to think about numbers, how many people are in that vehicle, what their faces look like, any distinguishing marks. He thought about pulling into a police station, but the nearest one was miles away, and he didn't want to commit to being tailgated that far. Finally, exhausted and feeling watched, he pulled into a diner he knew truckers liked, the kind of place with big booths and a lot of radio chatter. He parked and walked in. There were men at the counter who looked like they'd seen every version of highway trouble. The van circled a lot, idling, then slid into a distant parking bay as if content to wait. One of the truckers followed him outside, a man with a cap and a weathered face who had been watching the whole time. The trucker launched the van with a look that said he'd seen it all and then some. He walked over to the van, its windows up, and shouted something at the driver.
The van's driver glanced back, and then, after what felt like a small eternity, pulled out and left the lot, easing back onto the interstate as if the whole thing had been a prank that finally lost its appetite. He watched the van disappear into the night and felt something in his chest unclenched so hard it hurt. The trucker clapped him on the shoulder and said, "You did right coming here. Don't go back on the road alone for a while." They both laughed, an awkward sound that was half relief and half disbelief. Later, leaning into the tailgate of his own pickup to toss a bag of trash, he noticed dark smudges along the metal, grimy streaks that threaded across the surface like someone's hand had been dragged there. They weren't fresh blood or anything dramatic. They were fingerprints and smears, the kind of thing that proves something physical took place. He wiped them with a napkin until his hand hurt, and the metal still held the memory of those marks in the way surfaces do. He kept the job for months after, because bills don't stop and because you sometimes rationalize the dangerous parts away, but the memory settled into his bones. He started leaving earlier when he could, filling the tank before the sun dropped, taking rest areas that were busier. He traded a route for one that had more daylight stops. One night, months later, he handed in his resignation. He said it was a small thing, sleep, family, less road, but you could tell by the way his fingers fiddled with a lighter when he talked that something else, a long, patient fear, had finally made the decision for him. He kept the napkin where he'd wiped the smudges for a week, letting its dampness dry beside his work gloves. Maybe that was superstition, or maybe it was a way of holding on to proof that what happened was real. The van never came back. There were no calls to say whether anyone was charged or even identified. The proof he had was a greasy streak, and a trucker who'd stepped in at exactly the right second. Sometimes that's all the world gives you, a small, imperfect witness, and the knowledge that luck and the willingness of strangers can be the thing that gets you out. When you stitch these 4 stories together, the pattern is not dramatic in the cinematic sense. There are no clear villains unmasked, no tidy resolutions. Instead, you get the texture of things that push at the seam of ordinary life.
A man sitting on a convenience store floor, a red hatchback with a staged malady, a woman using a bathroom for something stranger than relief, a white van that decides to follow you like a thought. Each incident leaves behind something small and tangible: dented metal, zip ties, a dead battery, smudged fingerprints, and a bigger, vaguer residue, the feeling that the thin skin of civility can be pierced at almost any moment. I don't tell these stories to make people paranoid.
I tell them because there is value in the small, hard truth that sometimes you end up in a moment where nobody is guaranteed to help you, and where the decision you make in a second can change everything. The people I talked to didn't set out to be heroes or victims. They were people trying to be decent or trying to survive. Their stories are ordinary until they aren't, and that's the part that sticks with you. There are unanswered questions in every one of these accounts. Why did that man in the convenience store sprint to his truck and then decide to follow? Was the woman on Route 82 an accomplice or a victim? Did the woman at the gas station leave by herself, or was she waiting for someone else? Why did the van pick one driver to harass that night? Maybe we'll never have answers. Maybe the only thing to hold on to is what we can control: our awareness, our choices, the small rituals that keep us safer. Share your own highway horror stories in the comments. If you've been followed, harassed, or felt the brush of something you can't explain on a midnight road, your voice matters here. These stories are not meant to frighten you for the sake of it. They're reminders. Roads are full of strangers, and sometimes the ordinary becomes something else when the lights go down. If you want more real late-night encounters like these, like and subscribe. And when you leave your story below, try to include where it happened and what you learned. Sometimes the small details help someone else see what they almost missed. Drive safe out there. Keep your lights on, trust the strange knot in your gut, and if a story ever feels like it's worth telling, tell it, because the more we hear, the less alone these nights become.